Lecture 1, Scarcity and Economic Growth. Why study economics? It's the unspoken question that accompanies the slap of flip-flops on the floor and backpacks on the desk the first day of class. And it's often the first question addressed in the textbooks you hand out to fill up those backpacks. The answer is, of course, scarcity. Scarcity exists, and we have to deal with it. True, but not exactly compelling. You can almost hear the, and I should care because. How about you should care because of this? You could say it's hyperbole to suggest that the reason we should care about economics is that there are starving children all over the world. Just histrionics designed to convince bored teenagers that whatever we're selling in this classroom is worth several hours of their time and attention each week. They are, after all, pretty inured to trumped-up drama, both in their own lives and in the world the media creates around them. It's a good point, but in this case, I don't think it's hyperbole. We can make a convincing case for the connection between studying economics and caring about starving children. And as the textbooks argue so prosaically, it does begin with scarcity. Now, I promise that we'll get to the starving children, but we're going to start with Tinkerbell. Really, just bear with me here. We're going to do a little variation on the desert island experiment, or in the modern terms, you could think of it as a kind of virtual reality game. Suppose that, in an instant, the whole world as you know it disappears, and you find yourself, that's just you, on a desert island. I'm talking you, sand, seawater, that's it. Not good. But just as you begin to panic, who should appear but Tinkerbell? Tink quickly assesses your situation and offers to help you out. She can't get you off the island or restore your former life, but she gives you 15 seconds to write a list in the sand of everything you want and need. She promises that when the time's up, she'll magically provide you everything on the list before she disappears. Remember, though, that you have to be specific. Tink's not overly bright, and if you just give her broad categories, you're likely to be disappointed with what she brings. Okay, so just go with this, jot down a list. My experience is that you're likely to get one of two responses from students. People who practically think of all the so-called necessities, and people who go for it and put down the in your dreams stuff. If you do this in class and ask a few students to read their lists aloud and ask some pointed questions along the way, shelter? Oh, you mean like a little tent? Or food? You mean like packages of frozen Brussels sprouts and 3 boxes of Fruit Loops? Like I said, Tink's not overly bright. Or a car? But did you ask for gasoline? You'll quickly get the groans over things they forgot. So give in and give them another 15 seconds to add to their lists. You can probably let it run a few more times, but often just twice is enough to make the point. And the point is, why can't you have it all? You may have to navigate around some distractions like, because people don't work hard enough. Answer, but what if they did? Then could everyone have everything they want and need? Or, because duh, we don't have enough money. So what if we printed more? Then could everyone have everything they want and need? But eventually you're going to get there. We can't have everything we want because the earth isn't big enough, because there aren't enough resources. Let's look again at that traditional definition of scarcity and see if we can unpack it a little more. It's hard to accept, but scarcity isn't an option. It's a fact that resources are limited and wants and needs are unlimited. Now first, that's not a typo on the screen. I deliberately wrote wants and needs as one word, and we'll come back to it in a minute. But first, let's make sure that we understand that scarcity isn't optional. It's not just someone's opinion that resources are limited. We generally recognize 4 categories of resources: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And laying out the categories may make it easier to see the limits of each one. Land is econ speak for natural resources, and this broad category is perhaps better thought of as any gift of nature. A sunny climate, for example, or wind to turn a windmill, are natural resources just as much as crude oil or iron ore. Limits? Well, we might not know exactly how much of each natural resource there is, but, as the student said, the earth is only so big, so we know that there is a limit. Labor. Labor is any human effort, mental or physical. Be careful to distinguish labor from work. Horses and tractors can work, but they aren't labor in the economic sense because they aren't human. Limits? 24 hours in a day, and so far we haven't found a way to make more time or save it up to use later. Capital is the third category. It includes buildings, machines, tools, and technology. It should occur to you that capital isn't just out there for the finding. It has to be produced by man. So, the limits of capital are imposed by the limits of natural resources and labor from which capital is made. Entrepreneurship is the final category, somewhat abstractly defined as the willingness to undertake the risks of organizing land, labor, and capital for production. I suppose we could argue that human ingenuity isn't limited, and indeed, a noted economist named Julian Simon made such an argument. But risk-taking certainly seems to be limited. I mean, I'm not out there in business for myself, are you? I'll take my regular, predictable paycheck, thank you very much. So I can appreciate the contribution that risk-takers, entrepreneurs, make to the economy. So the fact of limits is part of the equation, but the other part is equally important. Human wants and needs are unlimited. Now, does this mean that people are all greedy little pigs, always grasping for more? Clearly not. And it doesn't deny the possibility that people may find themselves content with just what they have at the moment. Instead, it reflects the reality of life in a world where lots of people live their lives and their wants and needs happen. And the resources are still limited. Just a side note here, and an explanation of why I wrote wants and needs as one word. In terms of the basic problem of limited resources, it doesn't really matter whether they're wants or needs. The point is that there aren't enough resources to satisfy all of them. Perhaps when students are young, there's value in having them learn to prioritize, to understand that not all things are of equal value or worth equal sacrifice, that it's wise to satisfy our needs before our wants. But ultimately, that's a dilemma that individuals must address on their own. By the secondary level, asking students to spend time distinguishing wants from needs inevitably becomes an irresolvable argument about whose values are right, what should we need, and whether chocolate ice cream is a want or a need. It's a distraction, and it has the added unfortunate tendency to confirm the erroneous belief that the reason some people in the world can't satisfy their basic needs is that there are too many greedy people satisfying their unnecessary wants. Which brings us back to the main question of what it means to say that we should care about economics because children in the world are starving. It means that how we address the universal reality of scarcity matters. We're constrained in our ability to meet unlimited human wants and needs by the fact of limited resources, and ultimately, the wealth or poverty of nations is determined by how they choose to deal with that fact. As we begin to build a bridge from economic reasoning to the realities of wealth and poverty in the modern world, let's look at some historical evidence. Bottom line is that for all but the past couple of centuries, extreme, abject poverty was the norm of human existence. Thomas Hobbes famously described the life of man as nasty, brutish, and short, and he wasn't exaggerating. Look at these estimates of life expectancy at birth. They're depressing enough in the Middle Ages, but notice that they don't get a whole lot better in some parts of the world, even into the 20th century. Or look at this graph of the growth of world population over time. Take a minute to sort out what it's telling us. First, note the two axes. Time on the horizontal, world population on the vertical. Notice that for thousands of years, even after the second agricultural revolution, population growth barely creeps upward. Think about that in terms of what we've learned about scarcity. Here's how the process goes. Human wants and needs are satisfied by production, that is, using limited resources to make goods and services. If humans can't produce many goods and services, few of their wants and needs will be met. In other words, life is nasty, brutish, and short. If humans can find better ways to use their limited resources, they can produce more goods and services, more human needs can be met, and overall life is less nasty, brutish, and short. Scarcity retreats. It doesn't disappear, but it retreats. Population and well-being grow. That's the story that we see on this graph. The almost non-existent growth of world population before 1750 is evidence of the stranglehold of limited resources. The explosion of world population that began about 1750 and continues today is evidence that our ability to produce goods and services from limited resources has improved drastically, to the point that much of the world lives in comfort and worries and wonders why the rest does not. What happened in this story is economic growth, a sustained increase in the ability to produce goods and services in the face of continued resource limits. Think of it this way. Suppose the pie on the screen represents the value of all the goods and services a nation can produce with its limited resources. The standard of living or well-being of any person or group of people in the nation is represented by the red slice of the pie. Usually, some people and groups have bigger slices than others. But even if they all have the same size slice, how do they get more? How do they get more goods and services so that their standard of living rises? With the pie as it is, the only way for some people to have more is for others to have less. Notice that for the red slice to get bigger, the blue slice must get smaller. Regardless of the size of the individual slices, the only way for people to improve their lives is to take from someone else. Unless the pie gets bigger. If the pie grows, if there are more goods and services produced, then all the slices of well-being grow too, without taking away from anyone else. This is not to suggest that the benefits of economic growth are always or ever evenly distributed, but it does tell us that economic growth makes it possible for all to benefit at no one's expense. If we go back to our graph of world population over time, we're seeing the secret ingredient for growing the pie, and it's called productivity. Productivity is the term economists use to measure the output from a given set of resources in a given period of time. Increasing productivity means producing more goods and services from the same inputs. That, increasing productivity, is the key to economic growth and the accompanying improvements in standard of living. While the graph offers good news about our ongoing battle with scarcity, it raises some uncomfortable questions. Chief among them, why doesn't everybody benefit? I mean, if we know how to be more productive, why do we still have this? Why are some countries rich and some countries still poor? Why have some experienced economic growth and others have not? What can be done to promote economic growth in poor countries around the world? The short answer is that much of the difference between rich and poor nations of the world can be explained by looking at the institutions they adopt to deal with scarcity. Some of those institutions work well to promote economic growth, and some don't. Institutional analysis and the institutional perspective have grown increasingly important in economics in the past quarter century. Economic historian Douglas North was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his contributions to our understanding of how institutions change over time. North is credited with coining the useful definition of institutions as the rules of the game that govern how people interact and make choices. When you introduce the term institutions, your students will probably conjure up images of prisons or mental hospitals. So before we end this lecture, let's try to construct a common vocabulary that you can use with them, and that we'll be using throughout the rest of this course. Institutions are social arrangements. They can be formal or informal, but the important thing is that they shape incentives and outline the expected and acceptable forms of behavior in social interaction. That expected and acceptable forms of behavior is important to helping us move beyond thinking of institutions as places to thinking of institutions as rules of the game. With students, start with familiar examples where everybody knows the rules of the game. Like school. List some of the expected and acceptable forms of behavior that define the rules of the game for school. Try asking students how they would describe school, the experiences, not the building, to someone from another planet. Directed to think about behaviors and choices, students are likely to propose answers like, bells ring and people leave one class and go to another. Teachers are in charge of classrooms and you have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. You go to school on Monday through Friday, but not on the weekend. Now, students in many Asian countries would be surprised at this rule of the game. Another rule, you have to do homework, and if you don't, you get an F or detention. Another example that I've found works well is the institution of high school dating. Tell students the rules of the dating game when you were in high school. If you're as old as me, the girls never called boys thing is sure to get a laugh. And then illustrate institutional change by comparing the old-fashioned high school dating rules to those of today. Okay, at this point, let's look back at the economic reasoning propositions introduced in the opening lecture and focus on number 4. Note the underlined words. Institutions are laws, customs, moral principles, superstitions, and cultural values that influence people's choices. These basic institutions controlling behavior set out and establish the incentive structure and the basic design of the economic system. Institutions shape incentives. That's another concept central to economic reasoning. Incentives are rewards or punishments, carrots or sticks, that shape people's choices. Incentives can, of course, be monetary, and they often are. We'll see in later lessons that price is an extremely powerful incentive that predicts people's behavior with great reliability. But, as anyone who has watched peer pressure operate in a public school knows, non-monetary incentives can often be amazingly strong as well. The key for the development of our argument is recognizing that institutions, the rules of the game, shape incentives, and thus the choices people make in using their resources to produce goods and services. In other words, institutions affect productivity and economic growth. Nations that experience economic growth have institutions that reward increases in productivity. Impoverished nations don't. The work of economists like Douglas North has helped us to identify those wealth-promoting institutions: open markets, property rights secured by the rule of law, and entrepreneurship and innovation. Look back at our map of the rich and poor nations of the world. Although the institutions vary in form and strength from country to country, open markets, secure property rights, and entrepreneurship are characteristic of all wealthy nations, and sadly lacking in those that languish in poverty. In the lessons that follow, we'll look closely at the institutions found in wealthy nations to see how the incentives they create promote prosperity and economic growth. As we close then, let's summarize the big idea we've proposed as we construct our argument that economic reasoning is an essential tool in the fight against poverty. First, scarcity is, and it forces us to make choices. 2, economic growth is evidence of success in the fight against scarcity. Scarcity doesn't disappear. We still have to make choices, but we have more to choose from. And the result is higher standards of living. Third, some institutional arrangements, some sets of rules of the game encourage economic growth. The wealthy nations of the world have adopted these institutions. The poor nations have not. And finally, the institutions that encourage economic growth include open markets, property rights and the rule of law, and entrepreneurship and innovation. You've made it to the end of Lecture 1. Check the lesson guide for readings and assignments, and I'll meet you back here in Lesson 2.